All right, everybody, welcome to the first chapter of our second unit. This is chapter 6, the integumentary system. So this is page 89 to 99 in your guys' textbook. All right, so our goals here are to describe the structure and function of the integumentary system, as well as describe the accessory structures and their function. So you can mostly think of the integumentary system as your skin, but it's not just the skin. That's why it's not called the skin system. There's a lot of other structures like your hair and nails that are included in the integumentary system. So obviously this is our most external system, and it's also our largest organ. It covers the whole body. Another name for this would be the cutaneous membrane. And so as we said, the integumentary system is our skin. Obviously, that's the biggest portion, but it also has accessory structures like hair, nails, and glands. And we also have some subcutaneous tissue, and we'll get into that here shortly. Um, the skin has two major layers. We have the epidermis, which is the outermost layer, and then we have the dermis, which is below that. And then we'll also talk about the hypodermis, which is below the dermis. All right, so as we just said, the epidermis is the outermost layer of the skin. It's made up of stratified squamous epithelium. So if you remember back to chapter 5 when we talked about the different types of tissue, stratified squamous is what makes up our epidermis. So there's no blood vessels in the epidermis. It gets its oxygen and nutrients by diffusion from the dermal layer beneath. So the dermis has a lot of our functional structures like the blood vessels and capillaries and that kind of stuff. That does not extend all the way into the epidermis. All right, this is kind of just a big picture view. So here is our epidermis. You see all those squamous cells stacked on top of each other. That's what makes them stratified. And then you have our actual dermis here that contains a lot of our nerve endings and glands and our hair roots. And then you can see the blood vessels. So we'll talk about all this stuff individually, but this is just kind of a big picture view. And then down here you have the hypodermis or subcutaneous layer. Okay, you do not need to memorize all the different layers of epidermis. You do not need to memorize that. You need to know that the epidermis is made of stratified squamous epithelium. And it's considered keratinizing epithelium. I'm not sure if you guys have heard of the term keratin before. You see that in a lot of like hair and nail commercials and stuff like that. So keratin is a secretion that ends up hardening the cells. So you can see in this picture, they start off in this bottom layer that's known as your stratum germinativum. I can't even say that word. Stratum germinativum or the stratum basal. So that's the lowest layer. That's the first layer that is going to end up making contact with the dermis. And this is where mitosis begins to take place. So that cell division takes place down here. I know we just said that the epidermis is made of stratified squamous epithelium, but down here, this starts with columnar stem cells. And even though this bottom layer starts with a columnar shape, they're still considered a stratified squamous epithelium. So as they start to divide, you see it kind of pushes up and it squishes them down, pushes up, squishes them down. And as they stack on top of each other, they kind of flatten out and they harden with the keratin. So once we get up towards these top layers, the cells truly aren't really alive and dividing. They've kind of fully keratinized, but that gives them the protective property. Okay, so I'm hoping this should be an easy question. The epidermis is made of which type of tissue? So C, stratified squamous epithelium. I think I said that 3 or 4 times on that last epidermis slide. So many layers of flat cells. And then if you look back at the question, this is a good test taking example. You should, even if you couldn't remember which type, you know that it's stratified. So all of these other options don't even have the term stratified in it. So even if you just remember that one word, that would be your hint on this question. Okay, moving on to the dermis. That's the next layer down. So it lies below the epidermis, but above the hypodermis. And this is composed primarily of connective tissue. So there's two main types, which is your collagen. That's your fibers that give it strength. And it also has elastin, which gives it some elasticity. So that's why your skin can kind of move and glide. It's not just kind of stiff as a board. So the combination of those is held together with reticular fibers. And they really, their job is to really bind the collagen and elastin. So collagen for strength, elastin for some elasticity. Another feature of the dermis is the dermal papillae. When there's another picture that I'll show you where I'll highlight these. And papillae just means finger-like projections. And so these extend up from the dermis to interlock with the basal layer of the epidermis so that they bind together. So you'll see it almost fits together like a puzzle piece. All right, so within the dermis, we have a lot of accessory structures. Like we said, the epidermis is really just that flattened keratinized cells. There's not a whole lot else going on within the epidermis. Most of our accessory structures are contained within the dermis. So I already highlighted the blood vessels. So the capillaries that extend into the dermis will release blood and nutrients that can then diffuse up further to that basal layer of the epidermis as well. All right, so I'm actually going to jump down to the bottom of this slide here. You do not need to know these terms here. I need you to know that the sensory and nerve fibers are contained within the dermis. You'll see these if you take any more advanced anatomy classes. So this just breaks them down a little bit further. So the different cells and different types all have different jobs. So like your Merkel cells do light touch. Pacinian corpuscles, they do your pressure and vibration. Your Meissner corpuscles, they also do some light touch. Discriminative touch, which means I can tell you're poking me by my pinky versus you're poking me by my thumb when it's happening at the same time. And then you have your Ruffini endings. They detect stretch, temperature changes, and some joint movement and activity. So your Ruffini endings, this is just a kind of a fun fact, they adapt pretty slowly and they detect temperature. So that's why, part of why, say you get into a cold pool, it feels super cold at first, and then after you're in there long enough, it starts feeling pretty normal to you. All right, jumping back up to the glands, these you do need to know the difference about. So our first one is eccrine sweat glands. That is when we talk about sweat, you're thinking of eccrine sweat. So they cover a majority of our body and they open directly to the skin. Then you have your apocrine sweat glands. These are a little more specialized. They don't actually start functioning until puberty. And rather than opening directly to the skin, they open to a hair follicle. We find these primarily in our axillary or armpits and the anogenital region. So the big difference is eccrine way more abundant. That's our kind of our normal sweat glands, and they open directly to the skin. The apocrine open to a hair follicle, which then can release it towards the surface. You then have your sebaceous glands. So that secretes sebum, and that's a lubricant for our skin and hair. And then we also, one that's a little more specialized that I don't need you guys to necessarily keep track of in your memories is your ceremonous glands. And those are only found in the inner ear, and that's what secretes earwax, which is also known as cerumen. Okay, subcutaneous tissue or our hypodermis. So you have the initial superficial fascia right below the dermis. And then these little circles, you can kind of see the defined borders. Those are your adipocytes. So your adipose or fat cells. You see they kind of are contained in little pillows of fat. So just like we talked about fat previously, It's there for cushioning, insulation, and if we really need it, we can break it down for some reserve energy. And then down here, where it's a little bit kind of this pinkish stuff, is areolar connective tissue. It's kind of fluid-like. It's not as defined in terms of the adipose tissue, but it has connective tissue and a whole bunch of white blood cells. So this is kind of where some of our materials are stored, and then they can kind of pop up this way when needed for things such as an immune response or an inflammatory response. In this picture, look up this way. It's a little hard to see the definite defined borders, but you see how it kind of rolls like this? That's your papillae. So rather than being just one flat, smooth layer where they're just laying on top of each other, there's a little bit of a kind of like a rolling hill to it so that the epidermis can kind of lock in to the dermis and it holds together and moves together. Our actual skin functions. Protection, of course. So it stops bacteria and viruses and that kind of stuff from entering the body. Our surface secretions, like our sweat and sebum, that helps to block toxins and that kind of stuff. And it also helps you absorb the force of your injury, especially with, that's part of the reason why it's made up of collagen and elastin, because it's strong and it has a little give and flexibility to it. Barrier similar to protection. So in this case, we're talking about it more as a water barrier. So when it stops us from absorbing excess water. So when we're in the pool or in the shower, we don't just soak all that water up. It can also help prevent dehydration because it helps regulate our fluid loss. And then it can block UV radiation from reaching deeper layers. So that UV radiation that comes from our sunlight. And we'll talk a little bit more about that when we discuss skin color. Vitamin D production is a big one. So our skin itself doesn't produce vitamin D, but when it gets exposed to the UV light, that starts our chain reaction to begin vitamin D production. We just talked that it's part of our sensory perception, so it has all those cells in there that kind of tell our brains what we're feeling. And another big one, an important one, is thermoregulation. So there's kind of two ways that this can be done. The primary method, or the first line of defense, is by using our blood vessels. So if we constrict the blood vessels, we pull it back from the surface, and that helps us stay warmer. If we dilate the blood vessels, they open up, blood goes more towards the surface, and we can cool ourselves down by doing that. If we can't control it with just our constriction and dilation of the blood vessels, our brain is told, hey, we're still too hot. And so we can sweat. And then once we sweat, the sweat evaporates. And that's another method of cooling. So the sweat itself does not cool us down. We don't cool down because of our sweat on our skin. We cool down because the sweat on our skin evaporates. All right, skin color. So melanocytes are cells within the skin that secrete melanin, and that is our primary control of skin color. So these are found in the basal layer of the epidermis. Like I said, they produce melanin. This then accumulates within the cells in the epidermis. So there's two different types of melanin. I put those there just to make you guys aware. Don't need to memorize those. And then this part is definitely important. So skin color is determined by the type and amount of melanin, not the number of melanocytes. So in general, everybody has relatively the same amount of melanocytes. What varies is that some people produce a lot more melanin, and in some people, the melanin is metabolized slower, so it builds up more over time. All right, we're going to discuss some skin color abnormalities. I think this is really good to know because there's a little bit more clinical application to it. So cyanosis is a blue tint. And so that is a deficiency in oxygen. So that's why when you see someone choking on something, they get that blue in the face look. Jaundice is one that you'll definitely see a lot, especially if you go into anything within the healthcare field. So that's a yellowing of the skin, and it's usually quite noticeable in the whites of the eyes as well. And this is associated with impaired liver function. So people that have liver failure or alcoholics tend to get cirrhosis of the liver that impairs the function. And so because the liver is not functioning properly, we end up getting accumulation of bile, which has a yellow coloring to it and kind of stains the skin and whites of the eyes. Bronzing is just what it sounds like, golden brown skin color. So there's a few hormones that can cause this. This isn't like getting a tan. So it typically is from deficiency within the adrenal gland. One of these examples is Addison disease. I'm sure most of you guys have heard of albinism or someone who's albino or an animal that's albino. So obviously that's extremely pale skin, white hair. They get more of a pink in the whites of their eyes, actually. And that's just a genetic lack of melanin. Nothing causes that necessarily outside of genetics. Erythema, that's an abnormal redness. So that could be a sunburn, heat, exercise causes it. Some people can get it when they're angry or embarrassed. And that's just an increase in blood flow. On the opposite side of that, we have pallor, which is pale skin. And this is different than the pallor with, like albino is not considered pallor. Albino is lack of melanin. Pallor is a paler skin than what your normal skin is. And that's from decreased blood flow. So cold, again, emotions like fear or stress. If someone's having super low blood pressure or if they're bleeding somewhere and having blood loss, that can also cause pallor. And then finally, we have a bruise or hematoma, which is kind of the fancy name for a bruise. Obviously, we know that's that bluish, black, yellowish. And the reason that it turns that color is because in response to whatever hits us that caused the bruise or hematoma in the first place causes blood to come to that area. And then as our body breaks down that blood, that's what gives us that coloring and change in coloration as our bruise heals. Okay, question 2. Which of the following does not determine skin color? So is it A, the amount of melanin produced, B, blood flow to the skin, C, the amount of melanocytes present, or D, liver function? So we'll give you guys a second to think about that again. I again want to highlight in terms of our test taking skills and strategies, really pay attention to not questions. So I found on your quizzes and even on the exams a little bit, people were reading the questions a little too quick and thinking, hey, I got the right answer. But remember, pay attention to not, because there's 3 right answers here that do determine skin color. All right, let's move on to the answer. Okay. C, it's the amount of melanocytes present. And so the amount of melanin produced is the largest factor to skin color. So not the amount of melanocytes, it's the amount of melanin that those melanocytes produce. So increased or decreased blood flow can affect it. We talked about erythema and pallor, and then we also talked about impaired liver function. All right, I'm going to take a quick pause because my dog is going nuts, and we'll come back from there.